This is Test J, Section 2, question number 23. A philosopher says, an action is morally right if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. I would stop there and make sure I understand what's going on with that premise before I move on to the next premise. This premise can be used to prove that something is morally right. The trigger on that rule, the sufficient condition of that rule, is if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. That's a mouthful. And by the way, this is exactly the type of shit that lawyers argue about every single day. If you hate the LSAT, you're not going to like law school. If you hate the LSAT, you're not going to like legal practice. This is exactly lawyer shit, okay? What's the trigger on the rule again? Reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. Notice that it does not have to actually increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. Only it has to be reasonably expected. By whom? Well, it's unclear. Reasonably expected by somebody. That sounds like it's a standard that the lawyers are going to have to argue about. Notice that it also doesn't have to improve everybody's well-being. It has to improve the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it, which I think means that it might literally murder one person if it makes 999 people much happier. I think the aggregate well-being might have been improved in that case, or at least the lawyers are going to argue about it. Okay, so the first sentence can be used to prove that something is morally right if it can be reasonably expected that it would improve the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. Second sentence says, an action is morally wrong if and only if it would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. First thing I notice here is that if we don't know whether it's going to increase or decrease, like if it's not going to change the aggregate well-being, then we certainly don't know that it's morally right. But we do know that it's not morally wrong, because morally wrong is if and only if it's going to reasonably expect it to decrease the aggregate well-being. Okay. First sentence can be used to prove that something is morally right. The second sentence can be used to prove that something is or is not morally wrong, and that's because of the if and only if. So that means that you could use it to prove something is morally wrong. You could also use it to prove that something is not morally wrong. Last sentence. Thus, it says, actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged, as predicted, the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them, not what I predicted, are also right. But that's not justified by the facts on the page. The second sentence does prove that if it would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them, I know that that's not morally wrong, because morally wrong is if and only if it's going to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people it affects. So if it's unchanged, if it's reasonably expected not to change anything, then that action is not morally wrong. But the first sentence wouldn't make it so that it has to be morally right. The first sentence says if it's going to increase the well-being, then it's morally right. So there's a gap in the argument, and the question here asks us to plug that gap. It says the philosopher's conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. I was yelling at you earlier about how sufficient assumption questions are easy, and I believe that this is still an easy enough question as far as questions number 23 tend to go, okay? The questions at the end of each section tend to be vastly more difficult than the questions at the beginning of the section. So this would never have been a question number 3 or a question number 13. This is of the density and difficulty that we expect to see when we get near the end of the section. nobody in 35 minutes should have attempted this question if you're not already scoring like 170 or higher. Okay, we guess at the end of each section because we need to take our time and make sure that we get all of the earlier, easier, and intermediate difficulty questions. We have to get all of those correct. You didn't have any business doing this question on a 35-minute section unless you already have like 21 or 22 points in the bank. That said, I am going to predict the answer, I think, to this question. The conclusion of the argument says if it's unchanged, if it's expected to not change the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it, then it's morally right. But the only thing I know about this is that it's not morally wrong. Well, the evidence supports the idea that an action that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them are not morally wrong. That's the evidence that I have. I know I can prove that. I'm on solid footing. On this side of a chasm, the conclusion is over here saying, oh, so therefore it's morally right. But there's a big canyon in between those two things. I know that this set of actions is not morally wrong. But the conclusion of the argument is, therefore it's morally right. I'm going to build a very simple bridge here. If it's not morally wrong, then it is morally right. Because I know that I'm on firm footing over here, that this set of actions is not morally wrong. The conclusion that I want is, therefore it's morally right. I'm looking for an answer that says, anything that's not morally wrong is morally right. If that were true, that would prove the conclusion of the argument based on the evidence that we've already been given. Scan the answer choices here. That's exactly what C says, and the answer is C. This is an easy question once you reach the expert level. It's going to be bewildering and maybe even impossible for novices. Don't worry about this one if you're just starting out. Even if you're kind of intermediate, probably this is not the question that you need to worry about. But if you're knocking on the door of 165 or 170, I do think that you can understand this question. It's a sufficient assumption question. I had a bunch of evidence. I had a conclusion that wasn't really justified. I had to get from the evidence that I have to the conclusion that I wanted, and I was able to predict the answer here. If it's true that everything that's not morally wrong is morally right, then actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them, since they're not morally wrong, they have to be morally right, and that's why the answer here is C. That's a tough one, y'all, for a bonus class. I think there's probably a lot of new people here. If you are new, don't worry about it. There are lower hanging fruit everywhere on the LSAT. And you need to focus on making sure you get all of the easy ones right. Then focus on making sure that you get all the intermediate ones right. And you can save number 23 in each section for when you're already scoring 165 or 170. Is that fair? Oh, people think B was tempting. No action is both right and wrong. Yeah, but see, the thing is, I know that it's wrong. If you say, well, no action is both right and wrong, I know it's not wrong. Sorry, did I misspeak? I know it's not wrong. That's a fact. It's not wrong because it's not expected to decrease the aggregate well-being of the people it affects. It's not wrong. But if you come in and say, well, it can't be both wrong and right, I say, that doesn't do anything. I know that this thing is not wrong. But you saying it can't be both right and wrong doesn't prove that it must be right or wrong. You could reword B to make it correct if you said every action must be right or wrong. Then it would be correct. Because I know that these actions are not wrong. If everything had to be right or wrong, then a thing that's not wrong has to be right. But that's not what B says. B says you can't be both right and wrong at the same time, but you could be neither, and that's why B doesn't get us to the conclusion that this action is right.